Snow drifted like pale ash from a sky the color of tin, and the land lay silent under its weight. The cowboy rode with his collar turned high, breath rising in faint clouds before him, the leather of his saddle creaking in the stillness. The prairie stretched so wide it felt it might spill him into eternity, yet his eyes were drawn to the dark line just ahead, a ribbon of red slashed across the white. It wasn't much at first. A small stain, the kind a wounded animal might leave. But the wind had pressed it into the snow in a way that spoke of more than just a passing creature. He slowed his horse, leaned forward in the saddle, and followed. The trail widened, here a few drops, there a smear, until it became a path, meandering toward the low rise where his cabin stood. The cold bit deeper as he dismounted, boots sinking with a muted crunch. He walked the last yards, gloved hand brushing the revolver at his side. The door to the cabin was ajar, a thin thread of smoke escaping into the air, carrying the scent of burning pine. His chest tightened. He'd left it locked that morning. Inside, the lamplight glowed soft and dim, casting long shadows that flickered over the rough-hewn walls. The air was warmer than it should have been. Someone had stoked the fire. And then he saw them. Near the hearth, a young woman sat slumped against the stacked woodpile, her skirts soaked and clinging to her legs, snow melting into dark patches on the floor beneath her. A thin line of blood traced from her side to the boards. Her skin was pale, lips tinged with the faintest blue. Her eyes fluttered open, caught his, then slid closed again as if it cost too much to hold them there. Two boys knelt close to her, both small and sharp-eyed, their hair damp from melted snow. They could not have been more than 8, mirrors of one another, perhaps brothers, perhaps twins, watching him with the guarded stillness of wild deer. One clutched the other's sleeve tight, their thin shoulders drawn in against the chill. Beside them, wrapped in a wool blanket, a smaller bundle stirred and let out a faint cry, a baby girl, from the sound of it, before settling again. He crouched beside the woman, the boards creaking under his weight. The smell of blood mingled with pine smoke. She wasn't dead, her breathing came shallow but steady, and heat from fever radiated through the fabric of her dress. He pressed a hand to her side, finding the wound, a deep gash torn across the ribs. "You're safe here," he murmured, his voice low and even, the way he used to speak to calm a skittish colt. The words felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 days, not since his last trip into town for flour and coffee. The boys didn't answer, but one's eyes darted to the rifle mounted above the hearth, then back to him, as though weighing whether the man before them was enemy or salvation. He rose and moved to the shelf where he kept bandages and a tin of hot water beside the stove. His hands worked without hurry, steady, precise, though the quiet urgency in the air was unmistakable. He'd seen wounds like this before, out on the trail when help was far away and the cold had no mercy. When he returned to her, she stirred, trying to speak. A single word slipped from her lips, hoarse and nearly lost to the crackle of the fire. He couldn't make it out, but he caught the tremor in it, the strain of someone who had been running too long. He shook his head gently, not asking her for more just yet. The boys watched as he cleaned the wound. The eldest, or maybe just the bolder, shifted to block his brother's view when she winced. It was the kind of gesture that spoke of long months of fending for themselves, of carrying weight too heavy for a child's shoulders. He stitched her up by the firelight, each pull of the thread measured and deliberate. The snow hissed against the cabin's roof, wind whistling through the chinks in the logs, but inside, the warmth began to build. The baby made soft noises now and then, and the boys leaned close to hush her, as though afraid any sound might shatter this fragile shelter they'd found. When the bleeding was stopped and the wound dressed, he eased her onto the bed in the corner. Her eyes opened again for a heartbeat, meeting his with something unspoken, neither gratitude nor trust yet, but the faint recognition of one who has stepped, for the moment, out of the storm. He set a pot of beans on the stove, the smell soon filling the cabin. The boys didn't move toward the table until he nodded for them to come. They ate with the careful speed of the truly hungry, eyes flicking toward the bed now and then. When their bowls were empty, they sat on the floor beside their sister, leaning against each other in silence. He thought of asking where they'd come from, what had driven them across the snow in such a state, but the way they kept their gazes fixed on the fire told him the answers would not come tonight. Instead, he banked the flames and checked the latch on the door. Outside, the wind had risen, swirling snow so thick it swallowed the shape of the pines. Somewhere out there was the place they had fled, and perhaps the one they feared might follow. He settled into the chair near the hearth, rifle within reach. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them. In the shifting light, the lines of her face softened in sleep, and for the first time since he'd stepped into the cabin, he let out a slow breath. The storm might keep the world at bay for a night. After that, well, the prairie had its own way of deciding who stayed hidden and who did not. Morning came quietly, the storm having spent itself in the night. The light that seeped through the cabin's small window was thin and pale, falling across the bed where she lay. Her breathing was steadier now, though each rise and fall of her chest still carried the weight of pain. The boys were awake before she was, sitting cross-legged by the fire, their eyes tracking his movements as he stirred the embers back to life. He poured water into the pot, the sound of it breaking the hush. The baby, swaddled tight, gave a soft, questioning cry. One of the boys lifted her with a practiced care that spoke of countless such mornings, hands too small for such a task, yet sure and unhesitating. Her fever lingered, but the color had returned faintly to her cheeks. When her eyes opened, they found him across the room, crouched over the stove. He offered no words at first, only the smell of coffee and the steady scrape of a spoon in the pot. She watched him as though weighing whether he was a man to be trusted, her gaze sharp despite the haze of exhaustion. He carried over a bowl, setting it in her lap with quiet deliberation. She hesitated, then took a small bite. The warmth seemed to root her here for a moment, the tight lines of her face easing just enough for him to see what she might look like without the shadow of fear. The boys ate next, still careful, as though any wrong move might send them back into the cold. He noticed the older one, if older he was, had a small tear in the sleeve of his coat, a raw edge where the fabric had frayed. Without speaking, he took the coat, patched it with a strip of canvas from an old feed sack, and returned it. The boy nodded once in thanks, eyes dropping quickly back to his food. The day stayed dim, the sky low and heavy. He worked on small tasks, splitting kindling, checking the latch on the door, melting snow for water. Now and then, the baby stirred, and the woman would rise on her elbow to soothe her, wincing but refusing to let the pain slow her. He saw the stubbornness in her, the same kind that had likely kept her moving through the storm until she reached his cabin. She spoke little, answering his questions in fragments. They had been walking since yesterday morning. The boys had taken turns carrying their sister until the snow became too deep. The wound, he didn't ask how it happened, had bled steadily since. She had no clear reason for why they turned toward this ridge instead of another. Perhaps it was chance, or perhaps the land itself had guided her here. By midday, the boys had begun to shadow him when he stepped outside, their boots crunching softly behind him. They followed to the corral, where the horses stood with steam rising off their backs. He showed them how to break the ice in the water trough with the back of an axe, and the older boy tried it himself, gripping the handle with both hands. The younger only watched, his eyes darting often toward the trees at the edge of the clearing. That look did not escape him. It was the look of someone who expects trouble from beyond the horizon. And though the snow had buried most tracks, he saw, faint and almost lost beneath the fresh layer, the mark of a single hoof-print on the slope above the cabin. It was old enough to be harmless, or fresh enough to mean someone had come close before the storm thickened. Inside, the fire kept its low roar. She sat by it now, her hair unpinned, falling over her shoulders in dark strands that caught the light. He noticed her watching the boys through the window as they moved around the yard. For all her guardedness, there was a softness in her gaze that no hardship could strip away. He brought in more wood and set it by the hearth. She glanced at him, and this time she spoke first, her voice low, the words edged with fatigue. "You live here alone?" He nodded. "Been that way for some time." Her eyes lingered on him, as if she meant to ask the next question, but thought better of it. Instead, she shifted the baby in her arms and turned her attention back to the fire. The afternoon passed with little talk. Yet something in the air had shifted, a quiet truce born not from trust, but from necessity. He began to see the outlines of who she was beneath the silence, a woman whose strength was not in what she said, but in the way she kept moving forward when standing still might have been easier. As dusk drew near, he stepped outside again, this time alone. The wind had settled into a whisper, the snow crisp beneath his boots. On the ridge, he paused, looking down over the cabin. A movement caught his eye, far off, where the trees thickened, a figure on horseback sat watching. The rider didn't move, didn't raise a hand in greeting. Just watched. By the time he returned to the cabin, the light was fading. He didn't mention the rider, not yet. Instead, he bolted the door, added another log to the fire, and set his rifle within reach. She met his eyes briefly, as if sensing something in his manner. But he only said it was going to be a colder night than the last, and that the storm had kept the worst of the world away for now. For now was the part he didn't speak aloud. The wind had eased by morning, leaving the world hushed beneath a heavy quilt of snow. Smoke from the chimney curled upward in the brittle air, and the light that spilled into the cabin was gentler than the day before. She was sitting up when he came in from the yard, her back braced against the wall, the baby cradled in her arms. Her eyes followed him without fear now, though the caution lingered, a quiet reminder that her trust was not something to be earned overnight. The boys were at the table, sorting through a small tin of nails he had given them. Their fingers worked deftly, lining each piece in neat rows, the way one might line cartridges before a hunt. He set down a pail of water, brushing snow from his coat, and poured her a cup. She took it without a word, sipping slowly, as though warming herself from the inside out. He asked if she had slept. Her gaze dropped to the child in her arms before answering. Some. Then, after a pause, she began speaking again, her voice quiet but steady. Her husband had been gone for 2 years, taken by an early thaw and a river that ran faster than he expected. Since then, she had worked where she could, keeping her children close, the mining camp a rough shelter in a land that offered few others. It was not a single moment that drove her to leave, but a gathering of them, a man with too much sway in the camp, a dispute she had no means to win, words that turned to threats. She kept her tone even, though her hands tightened on the baby's blanket. She said she thought distance would be enough. The wound at her side told her otherwise. He listened without pressing for names or details. Out here, some things were better left unnamed. What mattered was that she had come this far, and that whoever she had left behind might not see distance as a barrier. The boys had stopped sorting nails. They sat still, eyes fixed on their mother, as though hearing her story aloud bound it more firmly to the air. When she finished, the younger reached across the table to touch her sleeve, and she laid her free hand over his. He told her plainly that the land beyond the ridge was not often traveled in winter, that the cabin stood far enough from any road to be missed by chance. But he also told her he had seen riders 2 nights in a row, and that if they returned, it would not be for a friendly call. Her eyes searched his face for any sign of false comfort, finding none. The day stretched long and still. He repaired a hinge on the door while the boys fetched kindling from the woodpile. She tended the baby, moving slowly but with a quiet determination that made him think she had been carrying burdens far heavier than this injury for a long time. By afternoon, the snow had begun to glisten under a pale sun. He saddled his horse to check the southern slope, taking the older boy with him. The child rode behind him, small hands gripping the worn leather of the saddle. They said little on the ride, but when they reached the ridge, the boy pointed toward the tree line without a word. There, faint and almost lost to shadow, were 2 sets of tracks. Hooves had pressed deep into the snow, then turned back, as if the riders had stopped to watch before deciding against coming closer. The sight sat in his chest like a weight as they rode back. When they returned, she was standing by the window, her face unreadable. He told her what they had found. She didn't flinch, only shifted the baby in her arms and asked if the cabin's door could hold against more than the wind. "It can," he said, but the truth was that a door was only wood and iron. What held people safe was often the will of those inside, and the will of those willing to protect them. Night came early, the last of the light fading from the snow until the world beyond the window was nothing but darkness. The boys lay on the bed beside their mother, the baby between them. He sat in the chair near the fire, the rifle resting across his knees. The logs burned down to embers, their glow painting the walls in slow, shifting light. Outside, the silence was too complete, as if the land itself was listening. Somewhere out in that black expanse, men might be watching, deciding whether the snow would hide their approach. He looked toward the bed, at the small shapes huddled under blankets, and thought of how easily they could vanish from this place if he chose to send them away. But the thought didn't linger. He had made his choice the moment he stepped through his own door and found them there. The fire popped softly. She stirred, meeting his eyes across the room. No words passed between them, but something had shifted, no longer strangers bound only by circumstance, but two people bracing against the same wind. In that silence, he knew the next day would bring whatever it meant to bring. And if the riders returned, they would find the cabin less empty than they imagined. The day broke cold and clear, the kind of brittle light that makes every shadow sharp. He stepped outside with his coat drawn tight, the snow beneath his boots groaning in the silence. From the ridge, he could see far, too far, and what he saw pulled the air from his chest. 3 riders moved slow along the edge of the pines, their dark shapes breaking the white horizon. They weren't lost. They were looking. By the time he returned to the cabin, the boys were awake, stacking kindling beside the stove. She sat near the fire, feeding the baby, her gaze lifting to meet his the moment he closed the door. He didn't have to speak, she read the truth in his face. Her hand stilled on the blanket as she listened to him say what they both already knew: whoever was out there had come for her. The boys went quiet, their movements small, controlled, as though afraid to draw notice. She kept her voice steady when she told them to stay close, but the smallest boy's eyes were already filling. She reached for him with her free arm, pulling him against her side. He checked the rifle, sliding each cartridge into place with deliberate care. His hands were calm, but his mind was already measuring distance, counting the heartbeats between a decision and the echo of a shot. He'd known this land long enough to trust its cover, but the open ground before the cabin would give any man a clear aim. The hoofbeats came first as a tremor, a faint pulse beneath the snow. Then the sound grew, steady and unhurried, until the riders emerged from the trees, their horses moving through the drifts with practiced ease. They stopped well short of the cabin, the leader sitting tall in the saddle, his coat hanging open to show the revolver at his hip. The man called out, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. He said they were looking for someone, a woman with children who'd been seen passing this way. His tone was smooth, almost polite, but the weight beneath it was plain. The cowboy stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held easy but ready. He didn't answer right away, letting the silence settle until it felt like stone between them. When he spoke, his voice was even, the kind that doesn't invite argument. "No one here's looking for trouble, but you won't find what you're after." The leader smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. He said the woman belonged to him in one way or another. The cowboy's grip on the rifle didn't change, but something in his gaze did, hardening, sharpening, the way the prairie sky tightens before a storm. The other 2 riders shifted in their saddles, their hands near their weapons. He could see how this would play out if words failed, and words rarely lasted long out here. He told them once more to turn back, his voice low enough that they had to lean forward to catch it. The first shot came from the left, snow leaping where the bullet struck the porch rail. He dropped to one knee, returning fire without hesitation. The sound rolled across the clearing like thunder, and one of the riders jerked in the saddle before tumbling into the snow. The horses screamed, stamping and twisting in the drift. The leader fired back, the shot splintering wood inches from the door. He stepped sideways, sighted, and squeezed again. The man's revolver fell into the snow, his hand hanging limp. The third rider wheeled his horse and fled toward the trees, the sound of hooves fading fast. When the stillness returned, it was heavy and absolute. The injured man on the ground groaned, clutching his leg. The leader stared at the cabin for a long moment before turning his horse and following the other into the pines. He stood there in the cold, breath steaming, rifle still in hand, until he was sure the sound of retreat was real. Then he stepped back inside, closing the door against the wind. The boys were still by the fire, their eyes wide but dry. She was standing now, the baby against her shoulder, her gaze fixed on him with something more than relief, something deeper, harder to name. He set the rifle aside, pulling off his glove. "Told you the door would hold," he said, and the faintest curve touched the corner of her mouth. They spent the rest of the day in the quiet work of tending to what was theirs. He hauled more wood, repaired the splintered porch rail, and boiled water for coffee. She sat with the boys, speaking softly, their heads bent together like the pages of a closed book. When the sun dipped low, the cabin filled with a warm glow. The wind outside carried no threat now, only the restless voice of the open land. She crossed to him, standing close enough that the heat from the fire touched them both. "We were looking for somewhere to belong," she said, her voice low. He nodded, eyes on the flames. "Sometimes you don't find it," he said. "Sometimes you build it." She didn't answer, but her hand brushed his as she turned away, and in that small touch lay the quiet promise that some storms, once weathered together, change the shape of everything. That night, laughter came soft at first, from the boys as they played by the hearth. It grew, warm and unguarded, until even the wind seemed to pause outside to listen. And in the glow of the lamplight, with the snow deep around them, the cabin felt less like a place at the edge of the world and more like the center of it.